The Lewis gun jammed at the worst possible moment. Private First Class Daniel Kessler worked the cocking handle twice, felt the mechanism bind, and realized he was going to die on a ridge whose name he did not even know. Below him, through the smoke and the tangled jungle, he could see the Japanese infantry advancing in a slow, disciplined line, moving uphill through Kenai grass with rifles at the ready. His unit had retreated 10 minutes ago, falling back under orders when the battalion flank collapsed. Kessler had stayed behind to cover the withdrawal. Fire and control burst until the last man cleared the ridge. Now the gun was silent, the barrel too hot to touch, and the enemy was less than 60 yards away. He had 47 rounds left in the Pan magazine, no grenades, no radio, and no illusions about what would happen when they reached his position. He cleared the jam with hands that did not shake, slapped the magazine back into place, and settled the stock against his shoulder. The first Japanese soldier stepped into the open, moving cautiously between two fallen logs. Kessler put a 3-round burst into his chest and watched him drop. The line stopped when the ground and began returning fire. Bullets snapped through the air overhead, clipping leaves and splintering branches. Kessler shifted position, moved 5 yards to his left, and waited. The ridge was his now, for however long he could hold it. The date was August 9th, 1943. The location was Guadalcanal, though by that point in the campaign the fighting had spread across the Central Solomon Islands, a constellation of jungle-covered ridges and malarial swamps where American and Japanese forces contested every hilltop and creek bed. The strategic objective was control of the airfields. The tactical reality was a grinding war of attrition fought by exhausted infantry in terrain that defied conventional tactics. Units advanced in single file along narrow trails, fought at ranges measured in feet rather than yards, and died from disease as often as from bullets. Resupply was irregular, communication was difficult, and survival depended on small unit leadership and the willingness of individual soldiers to hold positions that doctrine said should be abandoned. Daniel Kessler was 23 years old, a farm kid from Iowa who had enlisted in early 1942 with romantic notions about serving his country and seeing the world. The world he saw was mud and jungle, and men dying slowly from infected wounds. The service he performed was carrying a 30-pound machine gun through swamps where the water came up to his thighs, and leeches attached themselves in clusters that had to be burned off with cigarettes. He was not a natural soldier. His marksmanship scores were average. His physical conditioning was acceptable but not exceptional, and he had no particular aptitude for violence. What he had, in quantities that surprised the squad leader and eventually defined his service, was an absolute refusal to quit once he committed to a task. If told to hold a position, he held it. If told to carry a load, he carried it. If told to cover a withdrawal, he stayed until withdrawal was complete, regardless of what that meant for his own safety. This quality, stubbornness elevated to the level of tactical principle, made him valuable in ways that training manuals did not address. The Lewis gun he carried was an anachronism by 1943 standards, a World War I-era design that had been largely replaced by more modern weapons in frontline units. But in the Pacific, where supply chains were strained and equipment was issued based on availability rather than preference, older weapons remained common. The Lewis fired the .30-06 cartridge from a distinctive top-mounted Pan magazine that held 47 or 97 rounds depending on configuration. It was air-cooled, which made it lighter than water-cooled designs, but also more prone to overheating during sustained fire. The effective range was around 600 yards, though accuracy degraded significantly beyond 300. The weapon was reliable if properly maintained, but maintenance in the jungle was a constant struggle against rust, moisture, and the fine volcanic dust that infiltrated every moving part. Kessler had learned to field strip and reassemble the gun in near total darkness, working by touch when his hands were too muddy to see. He had learned to estimate barrel temperature by the shimmer of heat rising from the cooling shroud, to recognize the subtle change in recoil that signaled an impending jam, and to clear stoppages in seconds rather than minutes. The gun was not a friend, not a companion, but a tool that demanded respect and constant attention. It had kept him alive through 6 weeks of combat, and now, alone on the ridge with the Japanese closing in, it was the only thing standing between him and a death that would be brief and violent. The ridge itself was not strategically significant in any conventional sense. It was a low spur of volcanic rock and clay, rising perhaps 60 feet above the surrounding jungle, covered in dense secondary growth and fallen timber. Division maps did not give a name, referring to it only by a grid coordinate that Kessler could not remember. But tactically, in the context of that specific morning's fighting, it was critical. The ridge overlooked a trail junction where two routes converged, routes that American forces were using to move supplies and reinforcements to the front. If the Japanese took the ridge, they could interdict that movement, forcing a detour that would add hours to transit times and expose columns to ambush. The battalion commander had ordered the ridge held for as long as possible, then authorized withdrawal when Japanese pressure became overwhelming. Kessler's platoon had held for 90 minutes before the order came to pull back. The withdrawal was executed under fire, men moving in pairs while others provided covering fire, a textbook retrograde action that should have resulted in minimal casualties. Kessler, positioned at the highest point of the ridge with good fields of fire, was designated to provide that covering fire. He fired in short bursts, conserving ammunition, targeting movement rather than individuals, keeping the enemy suppressed long enough for his platoon to disengage. When the last man disappeared into the jungle, Kessler should have followed. He could have abandoned position, low-crawled down the reverse slope, and rejoined his unit before the Japanese consolidated their advance. But he looked at the trail junction below, thought about the supply columns that would be moving through later that day, and made a decision that had no basis in orders or doctrine. He stayed. The Japanese advance resumed after a brief pause, more cautiously now that they had identified a position. Kessler watched them through gaps in the foliage, counting men and estimating strength. He saw at least 30, probably more, moving in two distinct groups that suggested platoon-level organization. They were not charging blindly, but advancing with tactical discipline, using cover, communicating with hand signals, coordinating their movement to minimize exposure. These were not green troops. They were veterans, experienced jungle fighters who understood how to reduce a fortified position to methodical pressure and suppressive fire. Against a full squad with supporting weapons, their tactics would have been sound. Against a single man with machine gun, the mathematics of the situation should have been obvious. They had numerical superiority, multiple angles of approach, and the ability to fix them in place while maneuvering for a flanking assault. Kessler had limited ammunition, no support, and a position that was indefensible in any prolonged engagement. But mathematics, Kessler understood, did not account for psychology. The Japanese did not know he was alone. They had seen sustained machine gun fire from a ridge, had taken casualties during the American withdrawal, and had no reason to believe that the covering force had been reduced to a single rifleman. As long as he could maintain fire, shift positions, and create the illusion of a defended strong point, they would approach cautiously, expending time and ammunition on suppression before committing to an assault. And time was what Kessler needed to give his battalion. Time for the supply columns to clear the junction. Time for reinforcements to arrive. Time for artillery to be brought forward. He did not think in terms of heroism or sacrifice. He thought in terms of minutes, of how many minutes he could buy, and what he would need to do to purchase them. The first probing attack came from his right flank. 3 men moving quickly through heavy brush, trying to reach a position where they could enfilade his line of fire. Kessler spotted the movement, traversed the Lewis gun, and fired a long burst that chewed through vegetation and sent the attackers scrambling for cover. He did not know if he hit anyone, but the advance stopped. He shifted position immediately, moving 15 yards to his left, dragging the gun and his remaining ammunition with him. Bullets cracked through the space he had just vacated, aimed at the muzzle flash from his last burst. He went to ground behind a fallen log, took 3 deep breaths, and scanned for targets. The enemy fire slackened, then stopped. Silence settled over the ridge, broken only by the ambient noise of the jungle, insects and birds, and the distant sound of artillery. Kessler used a pause to reload, swapping his nearly empty pan magazine for a full one, checking the action, clearing debris from the feed mechanism. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. He felt no fear, not because he was brave, but because fear required the luxury of thinking about the future, and he was entirely focused on the present moment. The next attack would come soon, probably from multiple directions, and he would need to choose his targets carefully. 47 rounds per magazine. 2 magazines remaining after the current load, 141 rounds total. He would need to make every burst count. The second attack was better coordinated. Suppressive fire from his front, simultaneous movement on both flanks. A classic three-point assault designed to overwhelm his ability to engage multiple threats. Kessler let them close to within 40 yards, tracking their movement through sound as much as sight, waiting for the moment when all 3 elements were committed and could not easily disengage. Then he opened fire on the center group, the suppression element, putting 2 bursts into their position and forcing them to ground. He traversed right, caught one of the flanking elements in the open, fired, saw men drop. Traversed left, fired again, shorter burst, conserving ammunition. The attack faltered. Men shouted in Japanese, voices tight with anger and confusion. They had expected to overrun a depleted position, had found instead a concentration of fire that suggested a prepared defense. Kessler moved again, this time crawling 30 yards to a position behind a cluster of volcanic boulders that offered better cover and a slightly elevated angle of fire. He was gambling that they would focus on his last firing position, would waste time and ammunition suppressing a location he no longer occupied. The gamble paid off. For 2 full minutes, the Japanese poured rifle fire into the log where he had been, the volume of fire so intense that the log itself disintegrated under the impact. Kessler waited motionless, watching. When the firing stopped, he counted to 10, then fired a single burst from his new position. The psychological effect was immediate. The enemy fire shifted, confused, and scattered as the Japanese tried to locate the new threat. Kessler had created, through movement and fire discipline, the impression of multiple firing positions, of a defense that was deeper and more robust than reality. It was an illusion built on tactics and timing, and it was working. The pattern repeated through the next hour. The Japanese would advance. Kessler would engage and displace. They would respond with overwhelming fire at positions he had already abandoned. The intervals between attacks grew longer as they reassessed their approach, brought forward more men, coordinated with adjacent units. Kessler used the pauses to redistribute his ammunition, to clear minor stoppages, to hydrate from a canteen that was nearly empty. He did not allow himself to think about the larger situation, about where his platoon was or whether help was coming. He focused on the immediate tactical problem, on maintaining the illusion, on buying minutes. His shoulder ached from the gun's recoil. His hands were blistered from the hot barrel shroud. His throat was raw from the cordite smoke that hung in the humid air. None of it mattered. What mattered was the next burst, the next displacement, the next decision about where to position himself and when to fire. The ridge had become his entire world. A 60-foot rise of mud and rock and vegetation that he defended through a combination of marksmanship and calculated deception. He did not think about holding the ridge. He thought about the next minute, and then the next, a series of present moments strung together into something that resembled a defense. By the time the Japanese committed to a full-scale assault, Kessler had been fighting alone for nearly 2 hours. He was down to his last magazine, 47 rounds, and the enemy was massing for what he knew would be the final push. He could see them through the trees, 30 or more men forming up in a loose skirmish line, fixing bayonets, preparing for a charge that would sweep over his position through sheer weight of numbers. He had no illusions about surviving the assault. At best, he could take a few more with him before they overran his position. At worst, he would die in the first seconds of the charge, cut down by mass rifle fire before he could respond. He checked the Lewis gun one last time, ensured the magazine was seated properly, and settled into a firing position behind the boulders. He would fire until the gun was empty or he was dead, whichever came first. There was no drama in the decision, no sense of sacrifice or nobility. It was simply the logical conclusion of the choice he had made 2 hours ago when he decided to stay. The Japanese line began to move, advancing uphill at a steady walk, rifles leveled, bayonets glinting in the filtered sunlight. Kessler put the front sight on the nearest man, began to squeeze the trigger, and then heard a sound that changed everything. It was a sound of artillery, distant at first, but growing rapidly louder, the distinctive shriek of incoming shells that every infantryman learned to recognize and fear. The first rounds impacted 50 yards downslope, short of the Japanese line, but close enough to send men diving for cover. The second volley was more accurate, landing among the advancing troops with devastating effect. Kessler watched as the skirmish line disintegrated, men killed or wounded or simply scattering in the face of barrage. The assault broke before it reached its position, the survivors retreating downslope in disorder, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The artillery continued for 5 minutes, methodical and precise, walking back and forth across the lower slopes of the ridge, interdicting the trail junction and forcing the Japanese to withdraw beyond effective range. When it stopped, the silence was profound. Kessler remained in position, unwilling to believe that the threat had passed, scanning for movement through the smoke and dust. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline that had sustained him through the fight beginning to drain away. He felt suddenly exhausted, his body recognizing the trauma it had suppressed for 2 hours. He did not move, could not move, simply sat with his back against the boulders and waited. 20 minutes later, an American patrol appeared, moving cautiously up the ridge, rifles at the ready. They found Kessler still at his position, surrounded by empty brass casings and ammunition pans, the Lewis gun resting across his lap. The patrol leader, a sergeant Kessler did not recognize, stared at him for a long moment, then asked a question that was both simple and complicated. He asked if Kessler was the only one who had stayed. Kessler nodded. The sergeant looked at the trail junction below, at the Japanese bodies scattered across the slope, at the defensive position that held against overwhelming force, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The mathematics of the situation spoke for themselves. The after-action report filed by battalion headquarters, document 42, confirmed Japanese casualties on the ridge, killed or wounded by machine gun fire from a single defensive position. The report noted that the position had been held for 2 hours and 17 minutes after the authorized withdrawal, delaying the enemy advance long enough for artillery to be repositioned and brought to bear. The report credited the defense with saving the trail junction and preventing the interdiction of supply routes critical to ongoing operations. The report did not mention Daniel Kessler by name, referring to him only as an unidentified machine gunner who had provided covering fire. Kessler was evacuated to a field hospital the same day, suffering from dehydration, heat exhaustion, and minor shrapnel wounds he had not noticed during the fight. He spent 3 days recovering, then returned to his unit and resumed his duties as a machine gunner. No formal commendation was awarded, no medals issued. The incident was noted in his service record as a footnote, a brief mention that he had remained in contact with the enemy after his unit withdrew. Years later, when historians began compiling detailed accounts of the Guadalcanal campaign, they found the after-action report and recognized its significance. A single soldier, armed with an obsolete weapon and limited ammunition, had held a position against platoon-strength forces through a combination of tactical discipline and psychological manipulation. The defense had not been heroic in any cinematic sense. It had been methodical, calculated, and brutally effective. It was the kind of action that military theorists study because it reveals fundamental truths about combat that transcend technology and doctrine. Daniel Kessler survived the war, though survival, as always, is a complicated term. He returned to Iowa in 1945, took over his family's farm, and lived a quiet life that bore no resemblance to the chaos of the Ridge. He married, raised children, and rarely spoke about the war except in the most general terms. When asked about his service, he mentioned that he had been a machine gunner in the Pacific, that he had seen some fighting, and that he was glad to be home. He did not mention the Ridge, the Lewis gun, or the 2 hours he spent alone against an enemy that should have overwhelmed him. The memory remained vivid and detailed, but it was not a memory he chose to share. It was too specific, too personal, and carried implications about fear and violence that he preferred not to examine. In the 1970s, a military historian researching small unit actions on Guadalcanal contacted Kessler, having traced his name through service records and battalion reports. The historian wanted to interview him, to document his recollections, to understand the tactical decisions he had made during the defense. Kessler declined politely but firmly. He said that what he remembered most clearly was not the fighting, but the silence afterward, the moment when the artillery stopped and he realized he was still alive. He said that he had not felt brave or heroic, only stubborn, unwilling to abandon a task he had started. He said that the ridge had not seemed important at the time, just another piece of jungle that needed to be held for another few minutes. The historian pressed, asked specific questions about fire discipline and defensive tactics, tried to extract lessons that could be applied to contemporary military doctrine. Kessler answered briefly, provided factual details without elaboration, and then ended the interview. He had nothing more to say. The ridge was in the past, and he had spent 30 years building a life that was separate from that memory. He was not interested in revisiting it. The tactical lessons of Kessler's defense are straightforward and have been incorporated into modern infantry training. First, the value of disciplined fire control cannot be overstated. Kessler's ability to conserve ammunition and engage targets selectively allowed him to sustain fire over a period that would have been impossible if he had simply held the trigger down. Second, movement and displacement are force multipliers when defending against superior numbers. By constantly shifting position, Kessler created uncertainty about the size and composition of the defensive force, complicating the enemy's ability to concentrate fire or coordinate assaults. Third, terrain awareness and exploitation are critical. Kessler used the natural features of the ridge, the boulders and fallen logs and vegetation, to create cover and concealment that enhanced the survivability. Fourth, psychological factors matter as much as physical ones in combat. The Japanese advance was slowed not just by casualties, but by the perception that they were facing prepared defense rather than a single isolated soldier. Kessler understood, intuitively or through experience, that the enemy's assessment of the situation could be shaped by his actions, and he used that understanding to buy time. These lessons are not theoretical. They are drawn from a specific action, a specific ridge, and a specific 2 hours when one man held a position that doctrine said should have been abandoned. Military training now incorporates scenarios designed to teach these principles, scenarios that replicate the conditions Kessler faced and ask soldiers to make the same kinds of tactical decisions. The instructors rarely mention Kessler by name, and many are unaware of the historical basis for the training exercises. But the lessons remain, encoded in doctrine and passed down through generations of infantry leaders. The broader significance of Kessler's action lies in what it reveals about the nature of defensive warfare and the role of individual initiative in shaping tactical outcomes. Military organizations are, by necessity, bureaucratic and hierarchical. They function through standardized procedures, clear chains of command, and explicit orders that define roles and responsibilities. But combat, particularly small unit combat in complex terrain, often demands decisions that fall outside the scope of doctrine. Kessler's decision to remain on the ridge after his unit withdrew was not authorized by any order. It violated the principle of unit cohesion, risked unnecessary casualties, and placed individual judgment above command guidance. By any conventional measure, it was a wrong decision. But the outcome, the delay of the Japanese advance and the preservation of critical supply routes, justified the action in retrospect. This creates a tension that military organizations have struggled with throughout history. How do you train soldiers to follow orders while also empowering them to exercise initiative when circumstances demand it? How do you balance the need for discipline with the recognition that rigid adherence to procedure can be as dangerous as reckless improvisation? Kessler's defense does not resolve this tension, but illustrates the stakes involved. A single soldier, acting on his own judgment, achieved a tactical result that shaped the outcome of a larger engagement. The result was not guaranteed. It could have failed catastrophically, could have resulted in Kessler's death without meaningful impact on the battle. But it succeeded, and that success raises questions about the relationship between individual agency and military effectiveness that remain relevant today. There's a photograph taken sometime in late 1943 that shows a group of soldiers from Kessler's battalion gathered around a Lewis gun, conducting maintenance in the field. The gun is partially disassembled, the barrel removed, the action exposed. Kessler is visible in the background, standing slightly apart from the group, his expression unreadable. The photograph was not taken on the ridge, was not connected to defense, but it captures something essential about the relationship between soldiers and their weapons. The gun is not a symbol or an icon. It is a tool, practical and unglamorous, that requires constant attention and care. Kessler understood this. He did not romanticize the Lewis gun or attribute agency to it. He maintained it, cleaned it, and used it effectively because his survival depended on its function. When the gun jammed at the start of the fight, he cleared the stoppage and continued firing because that was what the situation required. There was no drama, no existential crisis, just a mechanical problem that needed to be solved under pressure. This pragmatic relationship with equipment, the refusal to see weapons as anything more than tools, is characteristic of effective soldiers. It strips away the mythologies that surround military hardware and focuses attention on fundamentals, on training and maintenance and tactical employment. Kessler's defense was not a testament to the superiority of the Lewis gun or any particular piece of equipment. It was a testament to the effectiveness of a soldier who understood his weapon's capabilities and limitations, who used it within those constraints, and who adapted when circumstances changed. The story of the Ridge, like so many stories from the Pacific War, exists in the margins of official history. It does not appear in popular accounts of Guadalcanal, is not featured in documentaries or referenced in textbooks. The ridge itself is unmarked, its location identifiable only through cross-referencing grid coordinates in battalion records. There is no monument, no plaque, no indication that anything significant occurred there. The jungle has long since reclaimed the position, covering the boulders and fallen logs, erasing the scars left by bullets and artillery. If you were to visit the site today, assuming you could locate it, you would find no evidence of the fight. The Japanese bodies were buried or removed decades ago. The brass casings and ammunition pans have corroded into unrecognizable fragments. The trail junction, once critical to supply operations, is overgrown and unused. The ridge is silent, anonymous, one of thousands of similar places scattered across the Pacific Islands where men fought and died for objectives whose significance has faded with time. But the story persists, preserved in military records and the memories of the few who knew what happened. It persists because it speaks to something fundamental about war, about the moments when individuals are forced to make decisions that carry consequences far beyond their own survival. Kessler's decision to stay was not heroic in any conventional sense. It was stubborn, perhaps foolish, driven by a sense of duty that was more instinctive than rational. But it mattered. It bought time, saved lives, shaped outcomes. And in the final accounting, that is what soldiers do. They make decisions in the moment, with incomplete information and no guarantee of success. And those decisions aggregate into the larger patterns we call battles and campaigns and wars. Daniel Kessler died in 1989, at the age of 69, from complications related to lung disease. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service in a single sentence, noting that he had served in the Pacific during World War II. There was no mention of the ridge, no reference to the Lewis gun or the defense that had lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. His family, gathered at the funeral, knew he had been in combat, but had no detailed knowledge of his actions. He had not shared those stories, had deflected questions with vague generalities, and had made it clear that the war was not a subject he wished to discuss. After his death, his daughter found among his possessions a small notebook, a field diary he had kept during his service. The entries were brief and factual, noting dates and locations, and routine details of daily life in the combat zone. There was an entry for August 9th, 1943, the day of the ridge defense. It read, in its entirety, held position on ridge, artillery arrived, rejoined unit. 9 words to describe an action that had shaped the battle and defined a service. His daughter photocopied the diary and donated the original to a military museum, where it remains in the archives, accessible to researchers but rarely consulted. The entry for August 9th has been cited in a handful of academic papers, analyzed for what it reveals about soldier psychology and combat stress. But the brevity of the entry, the almost dismissive tone, is itself significant. Kessler did not view his actions as exceptional. He had stayed on the ridge because that was what the situation required. He had fought alone because his unit had withdrawn, and he had not. The defense had succeeded not because he was a hero, but because he was competent, disciplined, and unwilling to quit. That, more than any tactical detail, is the lesson of the ridge. War does not require heroes. It requires soldiers who will do what needs to be done, who will hold positions that seem hopeless, who will fire until the ammunition is gone or the threat is neutralized. Kessler was that kind of soldier, and the ridge, unnamed and unmarked, stands as testament to what one man can accomplish when he refuses to accept that a position is lost. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below, and if this moved you, subscribe for more stories that deserve to be remembered